So we're only a few weeks out from football, both college and the NFL. And Jovan, I've been looking through every sports book, trying to find every single bet, every future, making sure I've got all my bases covered. So I'm getting so excited for the season. And Jovan, I came across maybe the craziest college football bet I've ever seen. This has to be new. I've never seen this up there before. It's FCS versus FBS teams. And you could bet on over under 6.5 wins that the FCS teams, attain and accomplish against the FBS schools. This is the craziest bet I've ever seen. I've never seen something like this. That means they're paying somebody on the payroll over there at Green Book or Blue Book, wherever you're using, to literally come up with these lines, go over all, 119 FCS versus FBS matchups and try to crunch all the numbers and figure out how many upsets there's going to be. This is absurd. I mean, these are money games, Jovan. These FBS schools are paying these FCS teams to play them, and the sports books think around 6 or 7 of these big schools, these FBS guys are going to fall to the FCS little schools, right? Is this not the craziest bet you've seen, and at least the craziest college football future that you're able to bet on for the 2024 season?
Yeah, this is an insane bet and one that can be very fun to sweat, because the more I looked into it, the more I think there is some opportunity for some big dogs in these FCS teams to beat some of the FBS teams, maybe a lot of them at the bottom of the FBS. So I think it's a fun one. I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I think we might have found the most insane college football bet of the season right here. You guys are looking at it, okay? Feast your eyes. It's going to be a sweat, but let's see, Jovan. We're going to take a peep at the schedules, take a peep at some of these games, and see if we can come up with, 7 or more upsets, if you want to call them that, right, with these money games. I cannot believe this is even an available bet. We're going to go over it, but first, let's look at the history of this bet, if it were a thing in previous years. All I know is there's been less and less upsets between FCS and FBS teams year in, year out in recent years, Jovan. If you look back at the data, in 2021, there were 12 upsets. 12 FCS schools upset FBS teams. That's absurd. 2022, only 8. In 2023, last year, there was only 4. So why are we seeing this season, Jovan, for 2024, this number at 6.5? Do the books know something we don't? Do they think the FCS teams are going to be extra good, extra scrappy this year? Maybe it has to do with the NIL and the transfer portal, right? Being such a big thing. All these small schools in the FBS, these teams that aren't as great, that might struggle against an FCS squads. Typically they're losing their best players going to these Power 5 schools or all the best teams in the country. Maybe that has an effect on it. What are your thoughts on this high number this year?
I'll tell you what stood out to me the second that I looked at the schedule of all 119 of these games, which may explain why the number's at 6.5 after only 4 you saw last year. There are some repeat offenders that are not expected to be very good this year from the FBS, who have very previously lost to some FCS schools that are facing some damn good ones this year. So, again, I think there's some opportunity for these FCS teams to pull an upset.
Well, let's take a look at some of the best FCS teams for this upcoming season. They did drop a rankings for the FCS. That's crazy. That's somebody's job to do this. I'm jealous. Jovan, they've got South Dakota State and North Dakota State at 1 and 2. I feel like that's minus 1,000. We were going to see that when we pulled these rankings up. Those are always the 2 best teams in the FCS, I feel like.
Yes, and they get to play some much better teams than everybody else coming into this season, because talk about this. South Dakota State's playing Oklahoma State, who is coming off the Big 12 championship appearance, a ranked team, and then North Dakota State's playing Colorado. So opportunities a little slimmer for them, even though they are the better team, or much better teams than the rest of everybody on the list. But yeah, there are some worse teams that are going to be playing teams in those rankings. So I think that's probably where the best chance comes from.
Well, since you brought it up, do you think there's any chance that we see Colorado get upset in week 1? By that really, really good FCS school? I mean, the spread's at 8.5. Jovan, North Dakota State, they're only getting less than 10 points on the spread. Obviously, odds makers thinking this is going to be a ball game.
Yeah, I think it'll be close. I think it'll be pretty far from a pushover game by North Dakota State against Colorado, but I still think that Colorado probably edges that one out, maybe a little more emphatically on the other side with Oklahoma State going up against South Dakota State. So I don't want to say there's not a chance, but again, stark difference in some of the teams that I think they're facing, these FCS teams that actually have a shot to get this number to 7.
Okay, so we might be targeting some of the more sneaky schools, although there is a chance Colorado gets upset by North Dakota State. I agree with you. I do think Colorado probably pulls that one out. Maybe they don't cover that spread, minus 8.5, but I don't think that's one of the many losses Colorado has for this upcoming season. That's not what I'm seeing. We are going to take a look at some of these games on the schedule, Jovan. But before we do, I want to give a breakdown of how long this bet is going to last. It is a season-long college football wager, but the majority of these games are in the beginning of the season. More than half of the 119 games that they're about to face off against each other are in August, right? So you're going to know pretty early, a couple weeks into the season, Jovan, how this future bet is looking.
Yeah, you'll find out pretty quickly. So a lot of these teams are getting paid to go to FBS schools prior to them getting into non-conference play as a tune-up, which I guess for some of the worst schools that we're going to target, maybe it's not a tune-up and they catch an L. But yeah, we'll find out pretty quickly in the first couple weeks just how alive we are for 7.
There are a couple late season games, though. You got a couple in November. You've got Wofford playing South Carolina, who we're down on this year. Imagine it comes down to that game. That would be unbelievable. I'm hoping it doesn't, right? We're not in a good spot if it is, but that would be a crazy way to cash this over. Wofford upsetting the in-state South Carolina Gamecocks, who we do not think are going to be great this season. They might not even be with their coach at that point. They might have already fired him. We'll see.
Yeah, I think if we're getting later into the season, I think our best chance is UMass and another one of the games that we're talking about in just a couple seconds here. Other than that, most of the ones later in the season are against really, really good teams like Oklahoma, Clemson, and Florida State, or some schools that have FCS games much, much later. Don't think they're catching those losses.
Well, let's take a look at some of those games. Jovan, great job putting up some of the matchups. You're expecting some upsets here. Let's go over a couple of these puppies. I mean, there's some bigger name schools in the FBS that are on this list, Jovan, and you're not scared. You are not wavering. You've got schools like BYU. I mean, New Mexico's not great, but they're up there. Ball State, Mac Legends, who, by the way, they're going to be atrocious this season, and I love that play and that angle with Missouri State. There's some bigger name schools that people might not expect to get upset by an FCS school, but, I mean, as a Virginia Tech Hokie alum, I've seen JMU upset us before. I just saw Navy lose a couple of years ago to an FCS school, Delaware. Crazy, right? It does happen more than you think, although we have seen a slow decline in it. But as a contrarian, seeing the line this year at 6.5 with that overjuiced to -120 after only a couple last year, I feel like we're getting a bunch of upsets. Jovan, take me through a couple of these matchups and tell me what you're seeing.
Well, I'll tell you how I went about coming up with some of these matchups first. Obviously, I wanted to look at some of the teams that are higher ranked in the FCS. We're not FCS sharps here, but we know some of these teams with pedigree. We know some of these teams, how they're viewed in terms of the FCS. And I look to see where the experience lied and strengths on one side of the ball, whether it be offensively or defensively. And then pretty obviously, I looked at some of the worst teams in the FCS or the FBS, which New Mexico would fit that bill. They have a 2.5 win total, maybe 2 some places. Teams like Ball State, teams like Kennesaw State, who's coming up from the FCS. So that's what I just look for. Teams that I thought would be vulnerable, and you're playing a team that is more than respectable in the FCS. But the first one is interesting because the first one happens to be on week 0 against New Mexico with Montana State, who I believe is ranked 4th in the FCS in that little preseason poll. This is the only one of the bunch that I believe is going to be a favorite and a significant favorite at that. Looking at that look-ahead line, they're -9. So I'm not going to call that an auto win, but it feels very, very telling that they're that big of a favorite against an FBS team. So that's one I really like. Sacramento State, they've won back-to-back years against FBS opponents. They beat Colorado State in their own house by 31 2 years ago. And just last year, they beat Stanford against San Jose State. I think they have an opportunity. They actually have 2 FBS games between San Jose State and Fresno State, but I think San Jose State's a little more vulnerable. And then I guess some of the others that really stand out, like UT Martin is a pretty good offensive team, and they're playing Kennesaw State, who was 3-6 in their last year of FCS last year, and they're making the jump up to FBS. So there's a lot of pretty vulnerable teams, I would say here, Krabs.
You don't have UVA versus Richmond on this list. I'm a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, that one maybe didn't make the cut. Not by too much, though. There's some other ones. I guess the craziest one in this list that's the most similar is BYU Southern Illinois, because it's really hard for anybody to win at BYU, and an FCS team going in there. It's probably not too enticing. I know that look-ahead spread is at 18.5. So, again, some of these teams are just going to get blown out and have no shot. But Southern Illinois, the more I looked into them, not only are they good in the FCS, but they brought in a lot of defensive talent from the FBS and from power conferences, especially. So it wouldn't shock me if they weren't dead there. There's a couple on these lists that I think are just games that you're going to look and turn on and be like, no way they're losing this late in the game.
Does TCU play any FCS schools this year?
Yeah, they play LIU, Brooklyn. So, I mean, that's quite literally, I don't know why. Yeah, usually they schedule somebody like Tarleton, who like they're jumping up to FBS.
A local school right down there.
Yeah, local
right?
school.
Makes sense.
I don't know why the LIU, like what the connection was there scheduling was, because I mean that game's going to be 50-0 by halftime. So that's one that's not happening. But teams like, I mean, there's a lot of bad teams here in the FBS. Nevada's going to be bad, and Eastern Washington's had a couple down years for their standards in the FCS, but that's a team that we've seen and deep in the playoffs in the FCS for a couple years now. So wouldn't be surprised if that one happens. Like Fordham is also like a repeat offender, winning games against FBS teams, especially in the MAC. Central Arkansas, really good offense. Arkansas State, absolutely no defense. Southern Utah is pretty decent, and UTEP, I think, is going to bottom out this year. It can happen, Krabs. There's a lot of opportunity.
100%. And by the way, you mentioned Montana State being a favorite against New Mexico, who, by the way, might be the worst team in college football this upcoming season. That would surprise people, just knowing that there's one favorite in FCS school over an FBS team. If you ask people walking down the street, say, hey, how many FCS schools are favorites against FBS? First of all, they'd probably look at you like you're a freak, but they'd say 0. They'd say probably none, because that doesn't make any sense. Well, we got one hopefully under our belt there to start the season off with an early W, knock on wood. Don't want to jinx it too much. But Jovan, my point earlier, like, let's look at San Jose State. Okay, San Jose State, although they had a couple solid players last year, some graduated. Their best player, I think their QB graduated as well. If you're a solid player remaining on that team, a program that's just left for dead, you are going to hit the portal. You are taking your NIL bag. You're saying thank you and going on your way to your new school, a new program that's not absolute quail meat like San Jose State is, right? With NIL exploding and with the transfer portal being almost a given at this point, 30+% of D1 athletes hitting the portal, you're only going to see the bottom feeders of the FBS continue to get worse and worse. And the guys at the top, the Alabamas, the Auburns, the Clemsons, the Notre Dames, continue to get better and better. And that's only going to help FCS schools potentially pull off more upsets down the line. Because in my opinion, if you're a kid going to a school to play football at FCS level, you're going there. Anyways, the NIL, the transfer portal, that's not changing shit. The skill levels, the differentials there are not going to be, substantial, Jovan, at all. They're not changing much. But the FBS schools, those are the ones. The FBS schools are the ones that are changing significantly at the bottom because they absolutely stink and they're losing their one or two good players they had to real schools, right?
Yeah, not only that, but San Jose State's breaking into a whole new regime, and they happen to get Sacramento State, who, yes, they're an FBS school, but they're very experienced, and there's a lot of guys there that have been there the last 2 years when they beat FBS schools. They're getting them week 1. So if there's any time to get them, it's week 1.
There are some sneaky spots you have on here, and I'm going to say it again. Richmond plus 21, maybe a little sprinkle, maybe on the ML against UVA, in-state rivalry. I mean, UVA is going to be terrible. The fact that that spreads at 21 is ridiculous, but not one of the games that made the list here. Jovan, are there any other teams or games that you're looking at, honorable mention type, that did not make it up here that you wanted to mention?
Honorable mention, I guess, not getting off the list just yet because I didn't mention all of them, but that Chattanooga, Georgia State one is interesting because another thing that I was looking for was a couple teams that had weaknesses on one side of the ball too. And we've seen Georgia State defensively be bad for God knows how many years. They can score with anybody, but they can give them up to anybody. And Chattanooga is bringing back a 6-year quarterback who also has FBS experience and has been really good operating that offense. He had 1 year at them last year, and pretty much everybody's coming back. So like that one is really interesting to me. I guess as far as notable mentions, like we talked about, I mean, don't completely ignore North Dakota State and South Dakota State. I wouldn't be shocked if one of those two happened, but I feel like we're both in somewhat of agreement that it'll be close, could be close, but it might not be happening.
Yep. Coach Prime will probably find a way to luck his way into a W there. Yep. I'm with you.
Probably. I guess the ones that aren't on the list that are, I don't know, a little more likelihood of happening. UMass has a couple. They have a late game week 9 against Wagner, which Wagner's not supposed to be good. But again, we're targeting some of just the bottom feeder teams that are liable to lose. So I wouldn't be shocked if UMass picks up one or maybe a couple. They have a couple games on there. So that would be probably the team to target that's not on this list.
Now, the majority of these games are early on in the season, Jovan, but are there any on this list right here that are later that we should be looking out for that you remember?
I think the latest one is week 5, and that would be the UT Martin Kennesaw State game, which I don't know if that's one, or I don't want to say that's one that I feel that much confident about or that much more confident about than a lot of the others, but it's the one that makes the most sense because Kennesaw State is FBS team that is just FBS this season. Like they were three and six or something in the FCS last year, and they're just coming up. They have a 2.5 win total, not expected to be very good. So I would say it's the worst team of the crop. New Mexico is right there with them, but that one could be what the bet comes down to. I wouldn't be shocked if there's 6 going into that game.
And what's your favorite FCS versus FBS upsets? I'm assuming it's Montana State week 1, but besides that one, what's your favorite upset that you want to call here right now so that in a couple weeks I can call you smart when it happens?
Yeah, I won't count Montana State because they're -9, and I'm probably going to take them -9 in that game. I would say Central Arkansas against Arkansas State. And I'm kind of a fan of Arkansas State. I think they're going to be fun this year because they have a lot of offense, but they can't defend a parked car. So like that game could easily, I wouldn't be shocked to look up and we see one of those crazy games where it's like 55-52 and triple overtime. I feel like that one's going to be back and forth. Obviously like fun interstate rivalry with no defense. So that's the one I would target. I think honorable mention too, that Southern Utah UTEP game, because I am all over fading UTEP this season.
Oh yeah,
I would say Southern Utah is the team I would be least excited to back, looking at all 10 FBS teams or all 10 FCS teams on this list. But I think UTEP's just going to be that bad. So those two on the bottom there, I really like.
All right. Well, you guys heard it here first. Central Arkansas, Arkansas State. That's going to be must-watch TV. Mark your calendars now. Okay. And Jovan, all this talk is giving me PTSD, thinking about the Hokies losing to the JMU Dukes years ago. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. The question is, how many units are we putting on this puppy? It is a college football season-long future. I'm thinking 1.5, right? It is -120. Maybe a little 1.5, Geyserman. Get rid of some of that juice.
Maybe go a little 2 Geyser.
2 units.
Get you excited to sweat. Some underdogs.
All right. I mean, this bet is right up our alley. We're going to be taking underdogs the entire college football season. Why not lock in a future back in FCS teams to pull off the incredible and upset 7+ FBS schools this season? Jovan, it's a high number and probably for a reason. We'll see how it plays out, and I'll meet you at the cash counter probably when that Central Arkansas and Arkansas State game plays out.
Yeah, that would be something, wouldn't it, Krabs?
100%. 2 units. I'll meet you at the cash counter. We'll be seeing.